Hi, welcome to True Creeps, where the stories are true and the creeps are real. We'll cover stories from grotesque gore to the possibly plausible paranormal, to horrifying history, to tense and terrible true crime, and everything else that goes bump in the night. We're your hosts, Amanda. And I'm Lindsay, and we want you to join us while we creep. We cover mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Hey everybody! Today we're going to be talking about sacred mushroom practices in Mexico. A very specific topic.
Very specific.
Welcome to Hyperfixation. This is part of our mushroom series. Shocker there. It's a little bit of another history-heavy episode. In our Spanish Inquisition episode, we talked about the Spanish Inquisition broadly, but also the Spanish Inquisition in Mexico and how that impacted the use of mushrooms. So if you're interested in seeing real-world impacts from the Spanish Inquisition, you might be interested in this episode. But it's also interesting if you're intrigued by psychedelics or religious practices that involve visions.
Yeah, so let's get into it. The ritual began in Sierra Mazateca, Oaxaca, Mexico, thousands of years ago. It centered around a mushroom called the de soto, which was considered sacred. It's unknown why they called it the de soto, as there isn't a language equivalent that it might have been based off of, which is interesting. They just came up with it.
Yeah.
It's rumored that the de soto came to Mazateca to hide in ancient times, but is originally from somewhere else. So what we gathered is that it was like a sentient being and that it was hiding from something.
And as we talk more about the ritual and why people used this particular mushroom in their religious practice, I think it'll make more sense why there's this kind of like supernatural element to it.
Mm-hmm.
But it also really makes me think of, in our first mushroom episode, we talked about the largest organism in the world, which was a single fungi mushroom dude. And it connected underground, right? And that it was, bigger than it looked because it looks like it was single instances of this fungi, but it was actually connected.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also talked about how fairy circles are actually one mushroom. They're just connected underground. And so I wonder if this culture understood that, like, the idea of how mushrooms and fungi can look like they're separate, but they're all one. And so they give it this kind of sentient idea because of that, because they're like, oh, it's this one thing and it has this powerful effect. And also hearing about what it does sound magical.
It does. Yes. So locals called the de soto the fruit of knowledge, and they believe that the mushroom has given the wisdom necessary to preserve the Americas from destruction. We read Tracing the Steps of the Ghost Dance by Michael Stewart Ani and got a good bit of information for today's episode from that article series.
Yeah.
And he said, quote, "The Ghost Dance celebrates the transfer of de soto's knowledge and the land, rituals, and culture of the Sierra Mazateca."
And the ghost dance is also the name of the ritual. So we'll typically say the ritual, but sometimes we'll reference the ghost dance. There are other mushroom rituals, but we're talking about this particular one.
I like the name.
I do too. Beautiful. Has a ghost in it. We like it. So let's start with where we are. Now, I had never heard of this particular type of terrain, so I found it very fascinating. What about you?
Same.
So they're found in cloud forests. It sounds so dreamy, doesn't it?
Yeah, magical, like this place that you'd read about in a fairy tale.
Yes. And so they are pretty unique. That's probably why we don't hear much about them. Cloud forests account for, at most, 1% of Mexico's territory, yet they're home to nearly 10% of the plant species in Mexico, which is pretty wild.
Yeah.
Humans have reduced the forest and their biodiversity significantly, though.
We suck.
And as their names suggest, they have constant cloud coverage, hence cloud forests. But while they're pretty humid, they're also relatively cold. At their warmest, they're about 73 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh, I love it.
Mm-hmm. The landscape has slopes and ravines with some valleys as well. In Sierra Mazateca, in northern Oaxaca, which is known by locals by its Aztec name, Teotitlan, Teotitlan is considered a divine place. And there is evidence of human settlements there dating as far back as 400 BC. And again, like, we're talking about this like magical looking place. So you're like, it's constant cloud coverage. There's tons of plants. How could you not see that as a spiritual place? Like, I have a hard time envisioning that. And when you look at pictures, 110%.
Yeah, for sure. So this was in the Mazatecas. The region was divided into two kingdoms, Mazateca Alta and Mazateca Baja, when settlers came at the start of the 12th century. Currently, there are about 26,000 indigenous Mazateca people who still live there. Their name was given to them by a neighboring population, the Nahuatl. Mazateca means deer people. The Mazatecans are suspected to be descendants of the Nonocala Chichimeca from the sacred city of Tula, who moved to the mountains at the start of the 1100s. Sound weird to say the 1100s. I don't know why, but it does.
It does. It does. It's also it's interesting to be able to trace a culture back that far. I don't know a lot about Mexican history, so this was part of the fun of researching today, was like learning about this particular indigenous population in these areas.
Yeah. So the kingdoms were overthrown by Mexica, also known as Aztecs, several times. They ruled the land until Christian missionaries and conquistadors arrived in 1542. Mazatecan culture development is difficult to trace because many died from diseases that were introduced by the Spanish, while others moved to small villages.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Conquistadors outlawed many of their religious practices, which caused immense changes in the practice of their religion. They actually outlawed any tradition that involved indigenous spiritual practices. Ceremonies that were once public ended up having to be hidden and super secretive because it was outlawed. Many people also converted to Christianity.
And if you haven't already listened to our Spanish Inquisition episode, that's what we talk about, is what the Spanish Inquisition was and this kind of connection. So the Mazatecan people, until very recently, were living in relative isolation from the modern world. They traveled via walking on paths. Trains of burros transported their primary crop, coffee beans, to markets in the plain. But now roads have been built along the edges of mountains to connect them with societies outside of their communities. So it's interesting that it's only recently that the way that they've connected with outside communities has changed. But we're going to go back in history a bit, and we're going to start talking about people coming to this area and experiencing the De Soto.
Mm-hmm.
So Bernardo de Sahagún, a Spanish missionary, witnessed an Aztec gathering and said, "They ate mushrooms with honey. When the mushrooms started having an effect, there was dancing and weeping. Some saw in their visions how they would die in war, some how they would become wealthy, some how they would commit adultery and would be stoned and have their skulls smashed in."
It's intense.
Yes. And he didn't examine the practices thoroughly before writing his account. So he's just kind of like writing what he's seeing. It's interesting how serious he describes the visions as an outsider, because having not experienced it, he doesn't really know what they're seeing.
Right, right. Other missionaries saw mushroom usage as a threat to Christianity because they thought the devil was speaking to people through their mushroom usage.
Did you ever see The Waterboy, Adam Sandler's movie?
When it came out a million years ago. Yeah.
Yes. Doesn't stand up to the test of times quite as much as one would want a movie to.
Yeah.
But it was on, and I was like playing on my phone. It was in the background. And I remembered Bobby Boucher being like, talking about like, his mom said something. He was like, yeah, it's the devil, right? And he's like sassing her back. And like, that is now what I imagine when it's like XYZ is the devil. Like,
right.
Because that kind of is what Christianity does, is they say like anything that is not what we like and how we like it for the reasons that we like it is therefore the devil and therefore evil.
Yeah. Or things that they just don't understand or haven't taken the time to really truly try to understand.
Yeah.
It just means it's evil. Like, that's just the easiest way. I don't want to know. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to learn about it. Get it away.
Well, it's also that at its very core, you can decide whether something that you don't understand is scary or is simply something you don't understand. And you don't need to understand something or someone to respect them. Like, you can make the decision to be okay with not understanding someone because like, or something.
Yeah, but a little bit of effort goes a long way.
But that's a topic for a different day.
Yeah.
Just like pointing that out, that like, it's a decision to be an asshole because you don't understand something. You can not understand it and not be a dick.
Right.
It's an option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Easy option. But anyways, mushrooms. So because they thought it was a threat to Christianity, the mushroom rituals were then forbidden. Conquistadors punished anyone who used the mushrooms. However, that didn't stop all people from using them. Conquistadors said that the name of their sacred mushroom meant flesh of God, which made it blasphemous to the church. The Spanish Inquisition set fire to thousands of holy books called codices, which destroyed much of the writing about the sacred mushroom ritual. Less than 20 of the codices survived, but not all contained information about the ghost dance. It's really sad.
Right?
So some of the codices that survived that mentioned the ghost dance and sacred mushrooms were Mixteca, Florentine, Vienna, and Borgia. In 1882, a Spaniard named Julian Diaz Ordaz, who was an expert mycologist from Catalonia, built a coffee plantation where sacred mushrooms grew. When he returned to Europe after the Mexican Revolution of 1912, he told people about sacred mushrooms. But stories about peyote rituals had already reached Berlin, so scientists just assumed that he was talking about peyote. Otherwise, his stories were largely ignored and considered exaggerations. So they're like, that didn't happen. Or, yeah, it was just peyote. You don't know what you're talking about.
It's hard to imagine what the effects of what people are talking about, right? Like, we're at a time when people don't really think about how substances can alter your brain in that way very much. Like, scientists, yes, but like the larger populace, I feel aren't like hallucinations. They're like, it's caused by the devil, or you have demons in your brain.
Well, and there wasn't proof back then, right? Like, you couldn't just take a video on your phone and be like, this is what happened. You have to believe what that person saw and experienced.
Exactly. So in 1936, an undercover missionary, Eunice Pike, who was disguised as a linguist expert, traveled to Alta to learn about the mushrooms. So the area that we're going to talk about with the sacred mushrooms today is going to be Alta in particular. But so Pike was sent there by Cameron Townsend, who had heard about the sacred mushrooms in a German community within Mexico. Townsend was the founder of the Wycliffe Fundamentalist Cult and the Summer Linguistics Institute. Around this time, so 1930s, German occultists were scouring the world for what Ani describes as, quote, answers to address an uncertain technological future, which I feel like in a lot of World War II movies that kind of are more leaning towards more fictional accounts, they lean into occult, like Nazi occult research.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear an actual version of this where this was happening, where they were looking for this particular. But so Pike was the first person to publish information about the, quote, poisonous mushroom rituals of Sierra Mazateca. And I think that that's really important because we're now talking about, we're entering a more contemporary age where it's not outwardly focused on its morality. It's more focused on its toxicity rather than, right? So it's the same reasoning, right? They're deeming it evil. So they're saying it's poisonous. And it's just interesting that that's when there's a little bit more of a quote unquote scientific spin to it. So indigenous folklore included a being known as the plumed serpent. And the plumed serpent is known as Quetzalcoatl. And he's a cultural hero that presented the cultural ideal. So like the best of the best, right? And because he was the plumed serpent, in Christianity, serpents are no good.
No good, yeah.
Yeah. And so Townsend and Pike basically took the name of this cultural ideal, mythical legend entity and said, okay, well, you sound like someone bad. And they said that he was the beast of Revelations, which is literally the opposite. And so further, Townsend and Pike believed that the sacred mushrooms were seeds that would conjure the beast of Revelations.
Interesting. So following Pike's publication, Blas Pablo Rico and Richard Evans Schultz took an interest in sacred mushrooms. Rico was an anthropologist and ethnobotanist. Schultz was an ethnobotanist. Schultz was the head of the ethnobiology department of Harvard and a pre-CIA operative. Pretty intense.
In sources, they said that, and I was like, I don't quite understand what that means, but I'm intrigued by it. And that is a question for another day because we have so many more mushroom episodes. But I was like, pre-CIA operative. Okay. Put a little pin in it.
I love it. He seems very important.
Amanda's like, oh, are we going to talk about that? And I'm like, nope. Talking about more mushrooms, baby.
Nope. Don't explore that. Just mushrooms forever. America began exploring military uses for the sacred mushroom because, like, that's all we ever do, right?
We can't have fucking nice things ever.
It's a weapon of some kind. So in 1938, Schultz and Rico traveled to Oaxaca to collect samples. In total, they brought back 3 samples, but weirdly, they only tested the third. Before this, there was not scientific confirmation that the plant that was being ingested wasn't akin to peyote. When they tested the sample that they had collected from Oaxaca, Schultz was able to confirm it was a mushroom. And again, that was just that third sample.
And also, as a note, peyote is a cactus.
Yes, correct.
So it's important to note that, like, they're like, okay, this is like a fully different type of thing.
Right.
So Arch Gordon Wasson, a mushroom researcher from the United States, went to Hualta with his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, in 1952 and met Maria Sabina. Now, in addition to being a mushroom researcher, like, that was like his like side gig, right? Like, Amanda and I
Okay.
are podcasters, but like we have other like primary titles in life for now.
Of course, yeah.
So, but Wasson was a conservative banker who lived in New York. Like, that was like his primary hustle, was like he was a banker. So like I love the idea that he was like, but I'm also a mushroom researcher. Because when people ask you what you do at a party or like when they meet you, what they mean is like, how do you make your money? And I hate it. I'm like, I work in corporate trust. Anyway, I have a podcast and a business. Let me tell you about those. They're way more interesting.
Right.
Like, you don't give a fuck about my day job. It's in the weeds. It's not a thing that most people want to talk about. But anyway, Wasson met the priest of the Catholic Church while in Hualta, and he reported having an experience with the sacred mushrooms. Interesting. Now, Wasson reached out to Eunice Pike, who we mentioned earlier, but she refused to help him get more information. The priest, however, introduced Wasson to Maria Sabina, who was a devout Catholic. So Wasson returned 2 years later after meeting with people and talking with them, and he became the first outsider who was able to participate in the sacred mushroom ceremony with the Mazatec people in Hualta in Mexico. When he came back, he also brought a photographer with him. And Wasson experienced his first ceremony under Maria's guidance and was amazed. And he called it the Veleda ceremony. Wasson believed that with the mushroom, he could communicate with his mother, and she had recently died. And so, like, what a powerful experience, right? First off, like, you're grieving, that's hard enough, but like, you ingest this thing and you think that you can do this, like, that's fucking powerful, right? Like, so far we're talking about people who can foresee their wealth, can foresee like the troubles they're going to have in life. They can see their own death, and he can do this amazing thing and talk to his mom. So he is then, not surprisingly, pretty worried that America was going to try to use the sacred mushroom for violent purposes.
Yeah.
So he decided to publish his experiences about the mushroom. So this way it wasn't a secret.
Yeah.
So he published an article titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom in 1957. And it was in Life magazine, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And in it, he talked about the effects of the mushrooms and the codices that we had talked about earlier. He also wrote about how he believed that the sacred mushroom could be the fruit of knowledge. And the fruit of knowledge is something that's from the early versions of the Bible, by the way. He also talked about Maria, and he believed that she could also talk to the dead with the use of the sacred mushroom.
That's amazing.
Right? It's interesting to see so many people having this experience, even a person who's an outsider who wasn't raised in a culture to be able to give it the appropriate reverence that it deserved, that he was still able to experience that ritual similar to the people who were native there.
Yeah, and be open to it.
Yes, yes.
Because typically outside of that culture, like you said, growing up with it, it would be very different. And for him to embrace it and then write about it,
Yeah.
it meant a lot. And he truly believed that that's what he was doing.
Yeah, because I mean, like, especially in America, if you talk about anything woo-woo, people are like, I don't know about that. Like, it's very much a what you see only, and what other people can verify that they see too is real.
Correct. Yeah. So from our understanding, there are several sacred mushroom ceremonies throughout Mexico, but they do have some similarities. The ceremonies are held at night. This is both to minimize distractions and intensify the mushroom taker's mental concentration. There's also a spiritual leader who is performing the ceremony. Typically, they perform it in their own home in front of a Catholic altar. The mushrooms are placed in a dried gourd, and then there are ritual prayers. And the prayers may vary widely, and they may include Catholic elements, Spanish, and indigenous languages. And then the mushrooms are typically ingested on an empty stomach.
It's interesting that the indigenous practices and folk magic are interwoven into Catholicism because it's the way it survived, right? Was by blending inside of Catholicism, right? Because you can have an altar so long as it's for Catholic deities, right? It sucks that it had to be done, but it's great that it could persevere.
Yes. So now that we've talked about the ceremonies, let's talk about the repercussions of Wasson's article. The article generated a swath of destructive tourism to Hualta. Tourists came to ingest the magic mushrooms, but didn't have respect for the culture, shamans, or healing ceremonies. They were just like, we're here to do this. We don't really care about all the like proper steps or what it actually means to this culture.
Mm-hmm.
When people became intoxicated, they were incredibly disrespectful to the locals. This also created a dilemma for locals. They had an economic opportunity to sell these mushrooms to the tourists, but they also didn't want to be disrespected because of their own cultural beliefs and taboos.
Yeah.
Which, like, fair. I feel like that's kind of tourism today, too. Like, in particular spots around the globe, where it's like, what's the right thing to do? Like, share it with everyone, but then have, like, those assholes that come and fuck everything up, or, like, keep it to themselves.
Well, it's also in a culture where when you didn't hide it, you were then persecuted.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Like, it doesn't seem like there's any benefit to sharing it with other people.
There's no winning.
Yeah. They're either going to hate you for it or they will like it so much that they cause more problems and try to take it from you.
Mm-hmm. So as an interesting note, the locals wouldn't say the name of the sacred mushroom to outsiders. So instead, they called the sacred mushrooms that they sold them derumbi. And this means landslide. They called them this because they typically grow in landslides.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, as a result of the aftermath of Watson's article, the community expelled Maria Sabina and even burned down her house because they were so angry about how their sacred ritual was being desecrated. Heartbreaking. Law enforcement also detained Sabina under suspicion that she was drug dealing. She was eventually released, and afterwards she made her living by giving lectures on the mushroom ritual. Although many people thought that she had gotten very wealthy from this, she was relatively impoverished when she died in 1985.
That's sad.
Exactly. Another consequence of the disrespectful tourists was that Hualta's municipal president outlawed the sale of the sacred mushroom. He did not, however, outlaw the sale of psilocybin cayubensis that grew from cow dung and sugarcane fields. Locals call these mushrooms San Istros, and these mushrooms were what began to be known as magic mushrooms.
Interesting. Also kind of gross.
Kind of gross. A lot of things grow from poop, though.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just interesting that when I think of magic mushrooms, I thought it was like, originally, before all of our mushroom research, I thought it was any hallucinogenic mushroom, but it was originally this specific one.
Mm-hmm.
So locals did not ingest this mushroom because, first off, it grew from waste from animals that Europeans introduced to the area, which is an interesting, like, extra wrinkle. And if you're thinking of, like, an ecosystem, right? Everything has its place. Everything has its reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
And an ecosystem is used to the waste from native animals.
Mm-hmm.
And it just does something different when you add animals from a different culture. But anyway, because it grew from the waste of animals that Europeans introduced, they would not ingest it. And also because they believed it was the mushroom of, quote, white man's saints.
Interesting.
Yes. Around the same time, a myth developed that the San Istros would show people where treasure was hidden.
Of course it would.
Mm-hmm. But the problem with that is that tourists were not from there because they were tourists, and they did not possess the survival skills to exist in, like, the rural landscape and to go hunting for treasure, right? Like,
yeah,
that's just a bad idea. Like, I'm going to take a magic mushroom and go live in the woods and try to treasure hunt.
People would still do it today, though.
People still do it today, but at least there's modern-ish technology.
Yeah.
So eventually, tourism died down.
And around this time, the Mexican military isolated Hualta from the outside world. The author of the article we read had traveled to Hualta during this time and decided to move there. He lived on a remote side of the mountain in the cloud forest where the DeSoto grew. The locals said the indigenous populations of the cloud forest would rob and kill outsiders, but Ani wasn't attacked. And that's because people believed that the DeSoto had brought Ani there and that he had a purpose to fulfill. Ani lived there for over 30 years. And during that time, he was the only outsider who had been allowed to live there in centuries.
Fascinating.
So, like, that's also part of it is, like, he was the only one. So it's, like, hard to learn about somewhere where many people weren't allowed to go or visit or, you know, bring back information.
Exactly. And we'll talk more about him in a little bit. But so another one of the visitors who went to Mexico after reading Watson's article was Dr. Timothy Leary. He traveled to Mexico in the 1960s and at the time was a chemist who was a visiting professor at Harvard. Dr. Leary was intrigued by the psychological uses of mushrooms rather than the culture or their use of the sacred mushrooms. After he returned from Mexico, he wrote his book, The Psychedelic Experience. Leary preferred the use of a synthesized chemical version of the wild mushrooms in Mexico. He began working with psilocybin and then lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. Hope I said that right. He shared the drug with some of his students, and this led the way to the psychedelic 60s.
He was the cool professor.
Right? Like, what? It's just also interesting, right? Because like when you're, first off, your professor being like, who wants some LSD?
Mm-hmm.
Wild. But so long ago, we talked about the CIA's experimentation with
Operation Midnight Climax.
You know, baby. And we'll get there again because we talked about it before in the context of government conspiracies and testing on people. But we'll talk more about the kind of conspiracy theories that float around mushrooms and their use. So we're giving you this a tiny bit of a taste here. But it's interesting that when you think of the psychedelic 60s, at least for me, I don't think of a small rural village in Mexico being where this really starts. And it is. And that's just, it's fascinating and also horrible that it comes from this plant that has this rich religious experience, but it was pulled from that so far.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people have interesting, amazing, life-changing experiences with psychedelics, but it's sad that it's not given the reverence that I think that it always should.
Yeah. Yeah. Like when you think of it today, that's not the first thing that comes to mind at all.
Exactly.
So the United States government was, of course, displeased with the popularization of sacred mushrooms' effects and began to cover up their own research into the possible military uses. So like it's on there now, right? Like a lot of these interesting, scary researches that they did, but for some time it was hidden away and like covered up.
Yeah.
In 1967, the United States federal government outlawed both LSD and psilocybin. Other countries also criminalized the use.
What I find fascinating is that most people think that controlled substances are controlled and banned for the populace's benefit. And that is not the case.
Mm-hmm.
This was, to me, it feels very clear that this was outlawed so that people were not seeing what it could do because the government wanted to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that very fascinating that that's why, to me, it seems like it was criminalized, not just because of what it could do.
Right, right. And they were studying it for a long time under the table in very strange ways. We've talked about, obviously, our favorite Operation Midnight Climax, but there were more.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's get back to Ani's experiences. In the first 6 years of moving to the cloud forest, Ani found over 100 distinct varieties of psychoactive mushrooms. During this time, the locals ate handfuls of mushrooms for their curative properties. The healers and witches of the region also used many of the varieties for their effects and for ceremonies. While they used the DeSoto, they also used what they called little birds, clowns, blue bleeders, and landslide mushrooms in their rituals.
I love these names.
Yeah, the names are great. Ani said that compared to psilocybin mushrooms, the DeSoto causes a, quote, pure visionary possession and barely has a psychedelic twinkle or tripping feeling. There's a very particular way that one must harvest a DeSoto, which Ani also shared. The mushroom has to be tapped on the cap so that the spores are released. When they are removed from the ground, the root must remain intact.
This feels like conservationist too, by the way.
It does, yeah. So once picked, they could not be shown to anyone other than the person that had picked it. Only a virgin girl or woman could clean the DeSoto. If the person was not a virgin maiden, then later in life, when they did get pregnant and gave birth, they would birth rats and snakes or be driven completely insane.
I would also venture to guess that if one who was a human gave birth to rats and snakes, they may fucking lose it. I think I would lose it if I were to birth a non-human entity that was clearly something else. Also, it feels like snakes would be relatively easy to birth.
The things you think.
In relation to a human. You're welcome. What's going on in this noggin? You never quite know.
That's just like an intense fear, though, right? In order to clean it? And like, if you lied and said you were, awkward conversations were had, I'm sure.
I would also imagine this would be a way of making sure that only some people were picking them and cleaning them and engaging in practices with them so that people weren't accidentally eating them or overpicking them. And like, it seems like an interesting way to do it, but it seems like it could also have been conservation based.
Possibly.
So that you were having even fewer people look at them because it was already a small area. So.
Right. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But the DeSoto are typically eaten in pairs to keep them from being lonely in their journey to the land of the dead. It's like a fun little tidbit.
That is darling, if you will.
Yeah.
I also feel like that is now a new way to get small children to eat.
Oh, yeah.
To be like, but that piece of broccoli is going to be lonely. Also, though, as a note, right, if you think that this is a supernatural being, right, a sentient creature, it
true.
makes sense that you wouldn't want it to be lonely.
That is true.
I just like the idea of our food being alone. A friend of a friend was talking to me. They were a dietitian. I can't remember their name. But they were talking about like people's relationship with food.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who had eating disorders, and they were talking about them like having trouble eating. And they were like, the way that they kind of help the person get around their blocks with eating is they were like, but your food's whole purpose is to feed and nourish you. Are you going to deprive it from fulfilling its purpose? And I was like, oh, I was like, that's a very interesting way of approaching it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so, okay, moving on. Carlos Castanera, who wrote the Don Juan books, was never allowed into the cloud forest, but visited the outer edges for 2-week spans several times. Within the books, he created a myth that the healers of the area would teach outsiders how to become a shaman. Sounds like a little bit of wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So after this myth took hold, because of his books, 3 or 4 of the varieties of the DeSoto have gone extinct.
How sad.
Mm-hmm. Locals attribute this to over-harvesting of the trees in the cloud forest, including the cedar tree, among others. So there are a few different varieties of the DeSoto, and 2 of them are actually pretty large. They grew to be over a foot tall, were pretty heavy. Their stem was hollow and translucent, and the cap was crisp black or yellowish tan. And the ones that kind of look like this are the only ones that are not eaten in pairs, as mentioned earlier, probably because they're large enough.
Yeah.
The third extinct variety looked like a waterlogged finger, and the cap is kind of starfish shaped.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the remaining variety, so like the only one of the 4 that is not extinct, grows 7 to 8 inches tall. Now, up until the 1970s, even discussing the mushroom traditions was taboo. And again, this started because of the fact that the Spanish Inquisition was punishing people so severely for these practices.
Mm-hmm.
So Ani said that the first time he heard them say the word DeSoto was in 1974. He mentioned in his article how people who lived in Sierra Mazateca their entire life had not heard relatives even say the name of their sacred mushroom, despite having practiced the mushroom rituals themselves. So he also knew that the locals had begun to worry that they had angered the DeSoto, and that as a result, it would no longer speak Mazatec. They said it had now began to speak English. But Ani wondered if the language that they heard was from where the DeSoto came from rather than English. Because again, we're saying like it was once someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible that like whatever they were hearing was simply a different language that they hadn't heard.
Right.
In 1988, the DeSoto mushrooms were destroyed in a violent hailstorm. And it was thought that they were extinct because from 1988, for about 18 years, there were very few sightings of the mushrooms. And the younger generation was becoming interested in the older cultural practices of the Mazatecs, but the mushroom appeared to be gone. And because remember now, like these are people who are growing up without that stigma and without that worry. And like while they can see that their family member has reverence for it, like there's not that same threat.
Yeah.
But the San Isidro that we mentioned earlier, they were not destroyed in the storm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So because the sacred mushroom was apparently gone, the rituals adapted shockingly quickly. They incorporated some of the hippie culture, and they had guitars, singing, and other mushrooms. The taboos around the rituals and the DeSoto were visibly absent. So there was also a new mushroom guru named Julieta Casimiro. Julieta had joined the International Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers. She had large mushroom ceremonies, and these ceremonies made her very wealthy. This also spurred a rapid growth for Hualta. The DeSoto returned in 2006. Many who had adopted the new mushroom ceremonies said the DeSoto and magic mushrooms were the same, but those that held the traditional ceremony actually disagreed, thought they were different. They don't think it has the same cultural significance and wisdom. Julieta herself thought the mushrooms also were different.
So we had that 18-year disappearance, then they come back in 2006. Then 12 years later, in 2018, the DeSoto began to dwindle again. Now, the back country of the region started to be developed, and it was killing the DeSoto's habitats. Then electricity and roads were built in Hualta. And that's when the DeSoto really stopped growing there at first. And so it's interesting that as more civilization began to grow, the DeSoto began to dwindle. And it's kind of interesting to think that it's physically disappearing at the same time that you can typically see that the more a culture becomes technological and becomes more industrial, that mystical and magical practices, there's less space for them. So it's interesting that it's kind of parallel of it like being...
Yeah, it's happening here.
Yeah. And so we haven't seen anything else that's talking about that DeSoto's growing more or anything like that before the pandemic. And so that's really where our episode ends today with the ghost dance rituals in Hualta. Fascinating.
Yeah, I never really considered where magic mushrooms came from and, you know, the religious aspect of it. Unfortunately, I don't know why, but it just never really occurred until recently.
I also hadn't thought a lot about psychedelic mushrooms or anything like that prior in my life. So when we were doing the research for this, again, we started research for one mushroom episode and we came across this and then had like a 5-digit word count. We were like, oh, we have to separate these.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this was one of the first things that we researched because we thought it was just so incredibly fascinating, like the roots of the psychedelic movement and how it really comes from a religious practice where people believe that they were ingesting and working with and experiencing this mystical presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, this is one of many mushroom episodes. We have a few more coming up, although most of them won't be nearly as history dense. We have a few more true crime even with mushrooms.
Yeah, we've got true crime. We've got a very specific, it is kind of a history one, but not nearly as history as the other two we've done. History kind of cryptid, if you will, creature, being, entity type thing. And our conspiracies, of course.
Of course, of course. We also have our podiversary coming up, so we're still looking for some listener stories. So if you have any spooky, strange, believing your gut stories, as Lindsay will add, we absolutely need them. We want to share them. This will be our 4th podiversary episode. And again, like those have always been my favorite, getting to know our listeners and hearing their voices for some of them.
Yes.
We'll also send you a very special sticker if you participate. So head to truecreeps.com and click submit your story. It'll have all of the details on how to submit. But we'd love to either have your voice on the show or a written account. But we do love listener stories. They're our absolute favorite.
Given the nature of today's episode, we are talking about the religious and spiritual practices of magic mushrooms. So if you have an experience that you would like to share anonymously, I'm going to underline that, anonymously, you can do that because, as we mentioned, they're not federally legal in the United States. So if you want to share your anonymous magic mushroom story, you can. Or if you happen to be in a place where it is legal, you can share that. But please put a little note that says it's legal where I am. So we're not trying to get anybody arrested.
Just be careful with your area because all of them are a little different.
Yeah. You just exercise all the judgment you need to. We don't want anyone to get in trouble.
And with that, have a great weekend.
Thanks for creeping with us. Thanks for listening, and as always, a special thank you to our patrons who support us via Patreon.
Please see the link in our show notes to learn more about how you, yes you, can begin to haunt the dump, guard vortexes, or even become a scorching Sasquatch.
Ooh. Also in our show notes, you can find the link to our website, more information on our sources, our social media handles, and our merch store.
We'd love for you to keep creeping with us. So if you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the show with your fellow creeps and or ghosts.
I beg of you.
Only a virgin girl or woman could clean the DeSoto.
I don't know.
I just went back to our wedding conversation about when you get a dress. And
yeah.
I just assumed they had to wear a particular dress to know which ones were allowed to do this.
Oh yeah, if it was an eggshell or a pure white. Yeah, I got you.
What was your quote?
I think I said something like, "You have to wear eggshell, you whore," or something like that. That sounds right.
Yeah. If the person was not a virgin maiden, then later in life, when they did get pregnant and gave birth, they would birth rats and snakes or be driven completely insane. Wouldn't it be cool to learn histories of other cultures within the U.S.?
Wild. Wouldn't it be cool to learn U.S. history within the U.S.?
That's true. Okay, that's true.
Not that I don't want to learn other cultures, but I'm just saying that the bar is like so much lower than other cultures. It's just like, do you know your own history? No, not unless you teach yourself.
Yes, and that's something that I didn't realize until I was an adult.
Yes.
You know, like when you look at things and you're like, I truly have no idea what that is. And then you spend hours, kind of like this episode, researching it and learning. And you're like, how cool would it have been to know the whole picture of something back when, you know, you're middle school, high school, instead of just like little blots of stuff.
Yeah, I remember a time in my life when I thought that history books had the history. Like, I thought that that was a thing. I mean, it was obviously naive and sheltered and privileged to see that. But like, I was like, this is the history. And I was like, nope, that's not.
And even like making these episodes, not necessarily this particular one, but some that we've done in the past, when I find a fact and I'm like, in my head, it's embedded from like U.S. history, a fact. And then I'm like, that was completely wrong. But like, we had to memorize it for a test, like incorrect information.
Mm-hmm.
Wild.
Yeah.
Schultz was the head of Jesus Christ.
Biology.
Biology. Learn your biology.
It's crazy how like when we have like hard words, we then can't say anything. Like we'll get the hard words and then suddenly nothing else.
And then it's just like gone.
It's blah, blah, blah,
blah. Okay. Schultz was the head of ethnobiology of the shit. Okay. Fuck my life. Okay. When it's like, I just want to get through this. And then I'm like, blah, 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 blah. Okay.
So, George, it says Gordon, but yet it's George to me, baby. Okay. He traveled to Mexico in the 1960s. So, why did I do that? Theo is making a guest appearance on the desk. Hello, baby.
The cat is trying to open the doorknob. So it's just jiggling the doorknob over and over again.
We're being overrun by cats right now, is what I'm hearing. Just mischief.
He does that when he wants in a room and he's not allowed in a room.
It's like, he's like his way of knocking.
Mm-hmm.
Ignore me, I'm just a silly bitch.
It's been a long week.